The flowers arrived in a pristine white box, tied with a red satin ribbon and a little card that read "Goodbye and good luck." At first, I smiled, thinking maybe my husband had remembered our anniversary. But tucked beneath the bouquet of perfectly bloomed roses was an envelope. Inside, divorce papers, served with petals. That moment shattered me, but only for a minute, because by the next morning, I'd already itemized the price of every flower, every year I wasted, and every insult I swallowed. If he wanted to treat our marriage like a transaction, then I was more than ready to send him the invoice. Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more real, emotional revenge stories that'll leave you speechless. When I first met Daniel, he was the kind of man that made silence feel comfortable. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, and that made him feel reliable. I was in my final year of college, juggling two part-time jobs and helping care for my younger brother after my father passed away. Daniel came from a different world. He worked in finance, wore tailored suits, and had a confidence that made him seem 10 years older than he was. Our first few months together felt like a fairy tale I hadn't realized I was allowed to be in. He opened doors, remembered little details, and sent me coffee during long shifts. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was consistent. And after the chaos I'd lived through, that consistency felt like gold. We got married 2 years later in a modest ceremony in my aunt's backyard. Daniel insisted on keeping things simple, saying he didn't believe in spending thousands on a single day. At the time, I took that as maturity. Looking back, it was the first glimpse into a man who only invested in things that benefited him directly. The wedding cost was split between my savings and a small contribution from my mother. Daniel paid for nothing, claiming he was covering the honeymoon instead. The honeymoon never happened. Work emergency, he said. I stayed home alone with unpacked bags and unused sunscreen. He didn't even send flowers then. Over the next 7 years, I became the glue of our home. I balanced a full-time marketing job, cooked dinner 5 nights a week, handled his dry cleaning, remembered his mother's birthday, and managed our bills. Daniel, meanwhile, climbed the corporate ladder. He switched companies twice and celebrated each promotion with his coworkers over scotch and cigars. I was never invited to those celebrations. It's just a guy's thing, he'd say, brushing off my questions with a kiss on the forehead and a distracted glance at his phone. Slowly, the man who once noticed everything began noticing nothing. He stopped asking how my day was. He didn't realize when I changed my hair. He never remembered our anniversary unless I reminded him. And even then, it would be a last-minute dinner where he stared more at his phone than at me. But I stayed because every time I thought of leaving, I remembered the promises we'd made, the effort I'd put in, the years I had invested. I thought marriage was hard, and maybe I just had to hold on a little longer until things turned around. I told myself he was stressed, distracted, tired, but I was all of those things too, and I was still trying. He had stopped trying years ago. Then came the day of the delivery. It was a Tuesday. I had just wrapped up a brutal client meeting and came home early hoping to decompress. A box was waiting at the door, wrapped beautifully in white and red. My heart stupidly fluttered. Maybe he was apologizing. Maybe he had remembered something. I opened it and found the most stunning bouquet of red roses I had ever seen. Beneath them, a slim white envelope with my name in his handwriting. For a second, I genuinely thought it might be a love letter. My hands trembled as I opened it. Instead, it was a set of formal divorce papers, signed, sealed, and dated a week prior. No note, no explanation. Just his signature and the cold outline of everything he wanted to take and everything he refused to give. He'd listed the car as his. The apartment, which was in both our names, he claimed as a business asset. Even the dog we rescued together 2 years ago was listed under non-negotiable property. The only thing he offered me was an optional meeting with a mediator. It was a breakup, not just of marriage, but of my entire sense of reality, disguised under a bow and some petals. I didn't cry. I wish I could say I collapsed in heartbreak, but I didn't. I stood there, numb, the scent of roses making me nauseous, After 15 minutes of silence, I packed the flowers back into the box and placed them in the freezer. I needed them preserved because I had just decided to assign them value. If he wanted to reduce our marriage to a business transaction, I would make sure he got the bill. That night, I dug out every receipt I had ever saved. Restaurant bills, grocery lists, home improvements, birthday gifts, medical expenses, travel costs, pet care. The list was endless. I opened a spreadsheet and began building a ledger. For every act of love I had shown, every dinner made, every shirt ironed, every errand run, I assigned a number. The flowers had 24 roses, so I wrote $25 per rose equals $600, emotional labor fee $500 per year x 7 years equals $3,500, anniversary reminders $75 per missed year equals $375. I itemized memories like invoices. I wasn't doing this out of bitterness. I was doing it for the woman I used to be, the one who kept giving and never got anything in return. As I organized the document, I also started organizing my life. I called a lawyer. She was sharp, young, and furious on my behalf. "He thinks you'll walk away quietly," she said. "We're going to make sure he regrets that." I gave her the spreadsheet. She smiled. "Let's make it legally interesting." Meanwhile, Daniel remained radio silent. Not even a text, no explanations, no apologies. I found out through mutual friends that he'd already moved in with someone else, a co-worker named Brielle, who I remembered only because I once saw her giggling at his jokes during a work event. So that's why he had seemed so stressed lately. The betrayal hit harder than I expected, but it only added fuel to my fire. This wasn't just about money now. It was about dignity. My lawyer filed a counterclaim the next week. We rejected mediation and filed a demand for equitable asset division and spousal compensation. Attached to the file, my spreadsheet, labeled Itemized Contribution Record, Marital Duration. The court date was set. Daniel's legal team called mine 3 times before the hearing to negotiate a quiet settlement. I refused. If he had the gall to send me divorce papers with roses, he could hear the bill in court. The night before the hearing, I pulled the flower box from the freezer. The roses were brittle now, frost, tipped and fragile. I plucked a single petal and pressed it into the folder I would carry into the courtroom, a symbol of every moment he thought was disposable. I wasn't disposable. Not anymore. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a strange sense of calm. I stood in front of the mirror in a navy blue dress, hair neatly pinned, no makeup beyond the basics. I didn't need glamour, I needed clarity. Power wasn't always about raising your voice. Sometimes it was about being so composed that your silence shook the room. My lawyer, Jenna, picked me up and gave me a reassuring smile. She had reviewed every number on my spreadsheet, studied every legal loophole he had tried to exploit, and had lined up 3 character witnesses. I hadn't asked for those. She had done it on her own. He underestimated the quiet one, she said as we pulled into the courthouse. He's about to find out that silence doesn't mean surrender. Daniel was already inside, flanked by his lawyer and a smug expression that hadn't changed since the day he dropped those papers on my doorstep. He barely looked at me. That stung, not because I wanted affection from him, but because it confirmed what I had feared all these years. He had stopped seeing me as a person a long time ago. To him, I was a role, a responsibility, a routine, and now that I no longer served a purpose in his perfectly compartmentalized life, he had replaced me and discarded the packaging. The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and little patience for theatrics, called the session to order. Daniel's lawyer began with an attempt to paint the marriage as mutually exhausted, saying we had simply drifted apart, and that Daniel had made every effort to resolve matters peacefully. Jenna raised one eyebrow at that, and when it was her turn to speak, she methodically dismantled their narrative. She referenced my spreadsheet, pointed out the frozen bouquet now documented as evidence, and laid out every financial detail Daniel had left out of the initial divorce proposal. She didn't need to be emotional. Facts were enough. Then came the part I hadn't anticipated. Jenna called me to the stand. I swallowed hard but nodded. As I took the oath and sat down, I saw Daniel fidgeting with his pen. Maybe for the first time, he realized I wasn't here to fade quietly. I looked at the judge, not at him, and began to speak. I was a wife for 7 years. I showed up, I supported him. I cooked, cleaned, worked full-time, remembered every birthday, and made sacrifices no one ever noticed. He sent me flowers with divorce papers, and no explanation. That's how little I mattered in the end, so I itemized what I gave, not out of pettiness, but because if he wants to reduce our marriage to paperwork, then he can pay for every petal. I didn't cry, my voice didn't tremble. I sat straight, spoke calmly, and let the silence afterward land exactly where it needed to. The judge nodded slowly, and even Daniel's lawyer seemed to shift uncomfortably in his seat. I stepped down and returned to my chair beside Jenna. The entire room felt heavier. Then came Jenna's final blow. She submitted screenshots, text messages from Daniel's phone to Brielle. Somehow, she had obtained them legally through discovery. In those texts, dated 2 months before he filed for divorce, Daniel joked about getting rid of the old model and referenced the consolation roses he planned to send. One text read, "I'll serve the papers with flowers." Clean and poetic. I closed my eyes for just a second. He had planned the entire thing like it was a corporate memo. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was furious. The judge excused both parties for a break while she reviewed the materials. In the hallway, Daniel finally approached me. "This is unnecessary," he said, keeping his voice low. "You're making this more dramatic than it needs to be." I stared at him for a long moment. "No, you did that when you mailed me a bouquet of betrayal and expected me to sign without a word. You made it cold. I just gave it the price tag." He opened his mouth to speak again, but Jenna stepped in. "That's enough, save it for the court." Daniel backed off, visibly flustered now. His control was slipping. Back inside, the judge delivered her decision with the precision of a surgeon. She ruled in my favor, not just for a fair asset split, but also for retroactive spousal support. She cited intentional emotional cruelty and concealment of a concurrent relationship as aggravating factors. I was awarded half the value of all marital property, a percentage of his annual bonus for the next 2 years, and full custody of our dog. She also ordered him to reimburse legal fees due to the proven attempt to suppress financial disclosures. Daniel's face went pale. He had walked in expecting a quiet exit. He left paying for every petal, and more. After the ruling, I exited the courthouse into the sunlit street and exhaled the breath I didn't realize I had been holding for months. Jenna hugged me tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You stood up," loudly. But it didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like closure. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, going over my now updated financial statement. The numbers looked brighter, not because of the money, but because of the accountability. He had wanted a clean break. I gave him a lesson. I posted one picture to my private friends, only social media, a single rose petal next to a line of text. He sent flowers to end it. I sent an invoice to honor it. The next day, I received a message from Brielle. She said, "I didn't know he was still married. I'm sorry." I didn't reply, because this wasn't about her. It wasn't even about him anymore. It was about reclaiming my time, my worth, and my story. I had been the quiet one, the compliant one, the forgettable wife in the background of his show. Now I was the author of my own script, and the next chapter was mine to write. The aftermath of the courtroom victory was both surreal and sobering. I had won, yes, but what lingered wasn't triumph. It was the empty silence of having severed ties with someone I had once trusted with my life. My apartment, now mine alone, felt unfamiliar. Every corner whispered memories, both sweet and sour. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where Daniel used to leave his briefcase, and for the first time in years, I felt the full weight of solitude. But beneath that loneliness was something stronger, clarity. A week after the court ruling, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was Daniel's formal request to finalize the financial transfer and arrange a pickup time for his remaining things. He had also included an informal note scrawled in his familiar sharp handwriting. "Let's keep this civil. No drama. Just want my stuff. No need to talk." It wasn't surprising, but it was insulting. Even after all this, he still believed that controlling the narrative was his right. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked into what used to be our shared closet and took stock of what he had left behind. Suits, ties, cufflinks, items he once meticulously arranged. I packed them all neatly, labeled the boxes, and stacked them by the door. But I kept one item, a dusty notebook tucked behind his old briefcase. It was his personal expense ledger, something he guarded more carefully than any shared memory between us. Out of curiosity, I opened it, and what I saw changed everything. The ledger documented every strategic expense Daniel had made over the past 2 years, from business dinners to personal gifts for Brielle, vacations he took without informing me, and even morale-boosting payments to junior associates that looked suspiciously like hush money. It was all there, dates, names, even amounts reimbursed by his company under false expense claims. My stomach turned. It wasn't just a betrayal of marriage anymore. It was fraud, serious corporate-level fraud. I didn't know what to do at first. A part of me wanted to throw the ledger away and move on. I had already won. Why drag myself through more mud? But another part of me, the part that remembered all the nights I stayed up balancing our budget while he dined on steak and whiskey, whispered, "He doesn't get to walk away clean." I made an appointment with Jenna, my lawyer. She flipped through the pages with increasing concern. "This isn't just shady, it's criminal," she said flatly. "If we submit this, there will be an investigation. You sure you want to go down this road?" I hesitated, then nodded. He served me divorce papers with roses. This isn't revenge, this is accountability. Jenna contacted a financial crime investigator she trusted. Within a week, an official complaint was filed with Daniel's company, along with evidence from the ledger. A discreet but active internal audit began. I didn't hear from Daniel during that time, but mutual acquaintances hinted that something was brewing. He stopped showing up to social events. His LinkedIn status quietly changed to "on sabbatical." Meanwhile, I started to rebuild. I redecorated the apartment, replacing the cold gray tones Daniel preferred with warmer hues. I adopted a second dog to keep our first one company. I started volunteering at a local nonprofit that helped women navigate divorce and financial abuse. It gave me purpose, a reason to step outside my own story. Then, about 6 weeks later, I received a call from someone in Daniel's company's HR department. The woman's voice was cautious, professional. "You were listed as a witness on an internal compliance review. We just wanted to verify the source of the expense ledger you submitted. It was found in my home in Daniel's belongings," I confirmed. I had no intention of keeping it hidden, but once I realized what it contained, I contacted my lawyer. "Understood," she said. "There will likely be formal proceedings. We appreciate your cooperation." A week later, the headline hit the business section. "Senior VP suspended amid expense fraud investigation." Daniel's photo, cropped from a company gala, was beneath the headline. I stared at it for a long moment, then set the paper down and went for a walk. I wasn't celebrating, but I wasn't crying either. Justice, I was learning, was rarely dramatic. It was quiet, slow, but when it came, it restored something deeper than pride. That weekend, Daniel called. First time since the divorce, I let it ring twice before answering. "I suppose you think you won," he said, no greeting, just accusation, no. I replied calmly, "I think you lost all by yourself." He exhaled heavily. "You always needed to be the victim." "No," I corrected. "I just finally stopped pretending I was okay being treated like one." He paused, likely caught off guard by my tone. "They're saying I might lose my license. You know what that means, don't you? You're destroying my career." I nearly laughed. "You destroyed your career the moment you turned our marriage into a cover story. I just handed over the receipts." He hung up without another word. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, then blocked his number. That was the day I truly felt free. Not because Daniel was falling apart, but because I no longer needed his recognition, his apology, or his love to validate my worth. The petals he once sent had turned into paper trails, and every single one had led me back to myself. When the formal notice arrived summoning Daniel to an internal disciplinary hearing, I expected him to lawyer up and lay low, but what I didn't expect was the counterstrike. His legal team sent a letter to mine alleging defamation, emotional distress, and unlawful dissemination of confidential documents. It was classic Daniel, a man so used to twisting facts that even truth felt like betrayal to him. But Jenna, calm as ever, scanned the document and smiled. "Let him dig," she said. "He doesn't realize the hole is already under him." In the weeks leading to the hearing, I was contacted by 2 former employees from Daniel's company. One, a junior analyst named Terry, told me she had been forced to backdate invoices to match Daniel's bogus claims. The other, a middle manager, admitted Daniel had used hush money to cover up an incident involving workplace harassment. It was all coming apart. The fraud wasn't isolated. It was a system he'd created. The day of the hearing, I was called in as a formal witness. Walking into the corporate building felt like entering enemy territory. But I was calm, composed, dressed in the very outfit Daniel once told me was too bold for someone like you. This time, the boldness was intentional. The panel of executives asked me to recount how I found the ledger. I explained clearly, without emotion. I provided context, offered timestamps, and corroborated with physical evidence. Daniel, seated across the long table, looked nothing like the man I once married. He looked hollow, angry, powerless. He avoided eye contact the entire time. After nearly 4 hours, the panel adjourned. I wasn't informed of the outcome directly, but 2 days later, Daniel's profile vanished from the company website. His name removed, his bio erased. The man who had built his identity on control, charm, and calculated success had been wiped out by the very documents he once thought were untouchable. He tried to save face. A post appeared on his private social media, taking time off to realign with my personal and professional goals, grateful for the journey. The comments were polite, few likes. People had started to distance themselves. Brielle, his former mistress, was nowhere in sight. Rumors said she had moved jobs. Others said she left the country, but I no longer cared. I focused on building my consulting business. My experience navigating a high-profile divorce, exposing fraud, and surviving emotional manipulation gave me a unique perspective. Clients began coming to me not just for legal referrals, but for guidance on starting over. I spoke at conferences, joined online panels, and slowly, quietly became a voice for women in similar situations. 6 months after the hearing, I received a small, unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a check for $13,000, a refund from Daniel's former company. A note was attached. Final reimbursement for co-owned expenses. Thank you for your cooperation. It was poetic. The man who had once tried to erase me with roses and silence now had to acknowledge my worth through cold, hard compensation. I cashed the check and donated half to the nonprofit that helped me rebuild. My story became one of quiet strength. I never sought to destroy Daniel. I simply refused to be buried by him. Each time he underestimated me, he handed me the very tools to rise. And now, years later, when I pass a flower shop, I sometimes pause at the roses. I don't feel anger anymore. I feel power, because I know that no matter how carefully someone tries to package betrayal in beauty, truth will always find a way to bloom. The fallout from Daniel's removal at the company was quieter than I had expected, but not any less impactful. Without the backing of a high-powered corporate title and the illusion of moral authority, he disappeared from the social circles that once welcomed him so eagerly. People who once praised his leadership now spoke of his arrogance in hushed tones. Friends turned distant. Colleagues deleted his number. His charm, once a golden ticket into every room, had become worthless the moment the truth surfaced. But as his world shrank, mine steadily expanded. The consulting work I had cautiously begun soon turned into something far more substantial. Word of mouth brought in a steady stream of clients, mostly women who had been silenced, overlooked, or financially manipulated in their marriages or workplaces. I didn't have all the answers, but I had the experience and, more importantly, I had the empathy that only someone who had been through it could offer. I coached them not just on reclaiming control over their finances, but also on how to trust their own judgment again. One client, a teacher named Erin, broke down in tears after our third session, saying, "You're the first person who didn't make me feel stupid for staying too long. I understood her. I had once been her." With the earnings from my consulting work and the refund Daniel's company had issued, I started looking for a new home, somewhere completely mine. I found a modest townhouse nestled in a quiet community just outside the city, close enough to everything I needed but far from the noise of the past. When I signed the purchase papers, I didn't cry or celebrate with champagne. I simply stood in the living room, surrounded by bare walls and echoing silence, and felt peace wash over me like sunlight through a clean window. That peace didn't mean life was suddenly perfect. Healing was not linear. There were days when I would find an old photo tucked into a book and feel a sharp pang of regret. Other days, I caught myself wondering if Daniel ever truly loved me or if I had just been convenient. But those thoughts passed quicker now. They no longer held the same power over me. They were just shadows, not storms. It wasn't long before I received another call, this time from a journalist. She was writing a piece on corporate ethics and wanted to include my story, anonymously if I preferred. At first I hesitated. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want to be the face of someone else's downfall. But then she said, "I think people need to know that women can fight back quietly and win." That resonated. I agreed on the condition that no names would be shared. When the article was published a few weeks later, it made waves in both corporate and social circles. I was flooded with messages, some from strangers who wanted to thank me, others from women who now felt encouraged to speak up in their own lives. Daniel never contacted me again. He never sent an apology, never acknowledged what had happened. But I didn't need him to. My closure wasn't dependent on his remorse. It came from the quiet victories, getting approved for a mortgage on my own, watching clients rebuild their confidence, feeling safe in a home without walking on eggshells. I no longer needed proof of his guilt or anyone else's validation of my truth. I had walked through the fire and come out the other side not just whole, but transformed. One day, while reorganizing some boxes in my new place, I came across the very first invoice I had ever submitted on behalf of both of us. Years ago, during our first year of marriage, it was a small bill, a shared dinner with friends, nothing significant. But I remembered how proud I'd felt taking care of our finances, managing the budget, believing we were a team. It was such a naive kind of hope, and yet I didn't feel bitter. That version of me had done her best with the knowledge she had. She had trusted, worked hard, given love freely. She wasn't foolish, she was simply unprotected, and now, finally, I had become the protector she always needed. That realization led to something unexpected. I decided to start a podcast, just a modest one at first. Each week, I shared a new story, sometimes mine, sometimes submitted by listeners. Stories of betrayal, resilience, reinvention. It became a safe space. One episode, Roses and Receipts, went viral unexpectedly. In it, I spoke openly about receiving flowers with divorce papers, about the symbolism of packaging cruelty with beauty. Listeners wrote in from all over the world. A woman in Brazil said it gave her the courage to leave her emotionally abusive partner. A military wife from Texas wrote, "I sent him a bill too, for every lie." As my voice reached farther, so did my sense of responsibility. I partnered with a nonprofit that helped women seek legal assistance in financial abuse cases. I donated part of every month's earnings from the podcast. I also started mentoring a small group of young women entering the corporate world, equipping them with the tools I had once lacked: financial literacy, emotional boundaries, and the confidence to walk away from any table where they were not respected. It was during one of these mentorship sessions that I was asked a question that stopped me cold. "Do you think you'll ever love again?" A young intern asked. Why? Died and sincere, I paused. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because it was the first time in years someone had asked it without a hint of judgment or pressure. I smiled and said yes, but this time I'll be the one choosing love, not just receiving it. That evening, I lit a candle and sat on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker like fireflies. The past still existed, yes, but it no longer haunted me. It simply informed the strength I carried now. I had become the woman I once needed during those cold nights, filled with silence and second guessing, and that woman was no longer afraid. In the months that followed my podcast's unexpected rise, life took on a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years, a rhythm that wasn't dictated by someone else's demands, appointments, or moods. It was entirely mine. I would wake up early, brew my coffee, and spend my mornings responding to messages from listeners. Some wrote to share how their marriages had fallen apart quietly over the years, how they stayed too long because they thought suffering in silence was strength. Others reached out to say thank you for putting into words what they couldn't yet articulate about their own experiences. It was humbling, overwhelming at times, but deeply healing. Every story I received stitched another patch in the fabric of my recovery. I had spent so long feeling invisible that being seen now felt like an entirely new kind of love. With the community growing steadily, I was approached by a women's empowerment conference to deliver a keynote on financial betrayal and emotional resilience. At first, I nearly declined. Public speaking had never been my strength, but my closest friends, ones I had gathered after my divorce, women who had seen me shattered and then steadily rise, encouraged me to accept. "You've been speaking your truth this whole time," one of them said. "Now you just need to do it in a bigger room." The night before the event, I couldn't sleep. I paced the floor, rehearsing lines second, guessing my story, my strength, my place among the speakers. But as I stood backstage the next day, microphone in hand and lights blindingly hot, I closed my eyes and remembered that moment at my kitchen table when I first saw the divorce papers. That cold, calculated arrangement of flowers and cruelty. That moment had almost broken me, and yet here I was alive, whole, and no longer afraid of speaking too loudly. When I finally stepped on stage, the applause was warm, not explosive. That was fine. I wasn't there for thunder. I was there to connect, and I did. I spoke for 30 minutes about the subtle signs of financial manipulation, the dangers of silence, and how healing begins the moment we stop making ourselves small for the comfort of others. The room stayed quiet throughout. A few women wiped their eyes, some nodded in silent understanding, and when I finished, I didn't expect a standing ovation. But I got one. It wasn't loud. It was respectful. It was powerful. It was everything. Afterward, as I stood by the exit greeting people, a woman in her 60s approached me. Her hair was silver, her posture proud. "I stayed in my marriage for 40 years, she said. "Everything you said today, I lived through it. But you," her voice cracked, "you got out. You helped me believe it's never too late to reclaim your voice." We hugged. That moment alone made the whole journey worth it. Meanwhile, Daniel's life had drifted into obscurity. From what little I heard through mutual friends, he had taken consulting gigs out of state, far away from where anyone knew the full story. He had deleted all his social media and moved into a condo paid for by what little savings he hadn't squandered. Brielle, as it turned out, had left him long before his job ended. Her name never appeared again in any article or conversation. Whatever fantasy they had built together had clearly been as unstable as its foundation. I never felt the need to reach out. What could be said? What was left to resolve? Some endings don't require closure. Sometimes the peace you find in your own life is the only resolution you need, and for me, that was enough. But there was one surprise I didn't see coming. I received an invitation to my niece's birthday party, Daniel's niece, to be exact. She had always liked me and stayed in touch even during the ugliest moments of the divorce. Her mother, Daniel's sister, had quietly supported me from the sidelines. I debated going. Would he be there? Would it be awkward? But something told me I should go. Not for Daniel, but for myself. To show up, to be visible, to exist confidently in the same air that once stifled me. So I went. The party was in a public park. Bright balloons, a bouncy house, children screaming with joy. When I arrived, a few people did a double take, but no one said anything rude. In fact, several guests came over and hugged me. One woman whispered, "I listen to your podcast every week. You changed my life." And then I saw him. Daniel stood near the picnic tables, wearing sunglasses and holding a plate of food he wasn't eating. He looked smaller, somehow, not physically, but energetically, like someone who had been reduced to only the bare essentials of existence. Our eyes met briefly. He nodded. I returned it politely, then I turned away. That single moment spoke volumes. There was nothing left to say. When I left the party, I felt light. Not because I'd avoided a scene, but because I had taken up space in a place that once belonged entirely to him. I had moved on so thoroughly that his presence didn't unsettle me anymore. If anything, it reminded me how far I'd come. Over time, my podcast evolved into a book. A publisher reached out, asking if I'd be willing to compile my story, and some of the anonymous ones I'd shared, into a cohesive narrative. I agreed. The process was daunting, deeply emotional, and at times exhausting. But it was also liberating. Putting everything down on paper, in my own words, on my own terms, felt like closing a chapter not with bitterness, but with grace. The book launched modestly, but received critical acclaim. Raw, empowering, and quietly revolutionary. One review said, another called it a lifeline disguised as a memoir. I didn't care much for praise, but I cared deeply for the impact. Women who had never heard my podcast now read my story and wrote to say they, too, had finally filed for divorce, or confronted a manipulator, or simply stopped apologizing for asking questions. By the time the book tour ended, I had spoken in front of hundreds, met survivors from all walks of life, and created a small foundation to provide emergency legal funds for women in toxic marriages. It was a full-circle moment, standing in a room with others who once felt as powerless as I had, now holding pens instead of petitions, rewriting their lives one page at a time. Looking back, I sometimes marvel at the beginning. A bouquet of roses, a stack of divorce papers, a woman brought to her knees not because she was weak, but because someone expected her to stay there. And yet, out of that humiliating moment bloomed something so much bigger than retribution. It was reclamation, reinvention, revival, and I now know this. Sometimes life hands you something that looks like the end, but with enough courage, enough truth, and enough silence broken, it can become the beginning you never knew you needed. In the quiet that followed the storm, I began to reflect not just on everything that had happened, but on the woman I had become because of it. I used to think closure would come with an apology, maybe a confession, maybe a sign of regret from Daniel. But as time passed, I realized closure wasn't something someone else could give me. It was something I had to claim. Piece by piece, I had rebuilt my life without him, and that alone was enough. I stopped needing explanations. I stopped checking to see if he would ever acknowledge the damage he'd caused. The truth was, I didn't need him to. My healing was not conditional on his remorse. It came from accepting the reality of what had been done to me, and then choosing, every single day, not to let that pain define me. I didn't want to live in reaction to him anymore. I wanted to live in response to myself, my values, my vision for the future. There were still hard days. Sometimes I'd walk past a florist and catch the scent of roses and feel a flicker of that gut punch moment when I opened his so-called gift. But those feelings didn't linger anymore. They didn't unravel me. They reminded me how far I'd come. They reminded me that I had once stood on the edge of ruin and found my footing anyway, and life, strangely enough, became more beautiful in its simplicity. I no longer had to measure my worth through someone else's affection or lack thereof. I was no longer afraid of being alone. Solitude became sacred, an affirmation that I could be whole all by myself. I read more. I cooked for joy, not performance. I traveled, sometimes on a whim, to places I'd once only dreamed of, and everywhere I went, I carried with me the knowledge that I had survived the worst and created something meaningful in its place. The consulting work flourished. The podcast turned into a platform for women everywhere to reclaim their stories. The book opened even more doors I never would have imagined walking through when I was married and suffocating under the weight of silence. And the foundation I started, it saved lives. It gave women options where they once had none. It became my proudest legacy. As for Daniel, he faded into the background. Occasionally his name would pop up in industry circles, usually followed by an awkward pause or a cautionary tone. He never apologized, never tried to return. But by then, I didn't need him to. He had become a character in a chapter I had already finished writing. If you're listening to this and you've been handed your own metaphorical bouquet of betrayal, whatever form it takes, I want you to know this: it's not the end. It might feel like it, and you might be drowning in grief and confusion, but it's not the end. It's the beginning. You are not weak for breaking. You are strong for healing, because healing isn't about becoming the person you were before the hurt. It's about becoming someone new, someone wiser, more compassionate, more in control of her own life. It's about sending the bill for every petal, every insult, every lie, and saying, "This is my worth, and I will never discount it again."